Breaking a spear shaft with a shield, would that work? Probably not. You can cut through a spear shaft, but it takes several blows with a sharp sword. It's not a lightsaber. Hi, I'm Matt Easton of Scholagladiatoria, and I teach people how to use things like spears and swords and daggers, and I also deal in antique weapons. I've been teaching people how to use weapons for 20 years, so today we're going to be looking at some polearm combat scenes from movies to judge how real they are. Okay, so stab in the foot there. That was really nice. And I think a lot of people might think that's silly, but funnily enough, there's an anonymous treatise from the early 16th century that repeatedly talks about stabbing the opponent in the foot and stabbing them in the crotch. So absolutely it was done. This kind of distraction tactic is in medieval treatises, so I love it. Okay, whoa. There's like spinning this thing around. So this is a thrusting weapon, but she is twirling it around like a snooker cue in a bar fight. That's not going to have much effect on people. It's not a good striking weapon. Thrust with it, it's a spear. Taking turns. So this is a favourite way for multiple people to attack a hero in a movie or a big villain, is to take turns at attacking them. Just attack them at the same time. Don't go 1, 2, 3, 4. So if they are trying to surround him, they should still have their spear points forward predominantly and form essentially a ring of points around him. Perhaps the only excuse you could give them is they're trying to capture him rather than trying to kill him. One of the things that really bugs me about spear use in Black Panther is that the spears are used more like quarterstaffs. Now, not to say you can't use a spear like a quarterstaff, you can strike with a spear. It's just not the most efficient and effective way of using a spear. If you've got a sharp point, use the sharp point. So I've got to be honest, I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. So tridents absolutely were used in combat, most famously by Roman gladiators, of course. That's the most famous example, but tridents did continue existing into the medieval period. The fact that you've got multiple projections at the head, the fact that they are heavier, this is a heavier weapon designed for fighting against armour. In that sense, that makes them more like this poleaxe here. He seems to have a secondary crossed guard a little bit lower down, which is quite interesting because there's a parallel with European poleaxes there as well, which has a hand guard here. That's not only to protect the hand, but it's also to give more force to the push. So if you're fighting in armour and you plant the cross, as it's called, in their armpit and you want to push them, it gives you something harder to push against. So one of the first things to note is how twirly this fight is. I'm not a huge fan of such turning. I mean, they turn their backs on each other so much. So there's a really nice technique there where he basically turns the back end of his weapon around his opponent's neck in order to throw him. It's sort of an impression of some of the techniques that we do see in historical treatises. And in armour, this is a very good way of overcoming someone. They can get up, but it's not that easy and it's not very quick. That gives you the opportunity to attack them while they're on the ground and disadvantaged. And you can look for the gaps in the armour like their armpits. There's a really nice technique there where the bad guy, one end of his weapon is locked up, and so he swings the other end of the weapon round to strike with the back end. And again, that's completely typical of poleaxe combat. If one end gets occupied or dealt with, then that being pushed aside, you immediately come round with the other end or the middle. I would give this about a 5. So Troy's really, really interesting because it's one of those rare occasions in movie fights where we see them actually attempting to use spear and shield together. You know, the spear and shield was absolutely the standard dueling weapon for heroes to fight with in the ancient world. And you only have to look at ancient Greek vases to see the two heroes standing in front of each other with the spear raised and the shield in front of them. Achilles lances his spear out at maximum length with a thrust, and that is predominantly how spears are supposed to be used. You grip it as near to the back of the shaft as you possibly can. It's actually remarkably difficult to find an opening to stab with a spear if the opponent has a large shield, as here. That's why people used them. Really, really nice detail there. We see Achilles switching the spear around, so he's using both ends of it. And in fact, we know in the ancient Greek world, spears often have two ends on them. Throughout history, a lot of types of spears have two ends on them. So you can stab with the main principal end, but you can also stab with the foot end or the heel. It's not usually so sharp or so big because it has to stand on the ground a lot of the time, but nevertheless, if you're being stabbed with it, it's fairly unpleasant. So there was one little minor detail there that kind of bugs me. Hector basically kind of slashes with his spear. And now with a typical spearhead like this, it's not going to have a lot of cutting potential. So, you know, I suppose it's fair that in a pinch, you might do this to make someone back off, especially if it's kind of face level. So it's going to make a person flinch or move away. But even if it had connected, it wouldn't have done an awful lot of damage. It would have been like being hit with a stick, basically. Resting the spear on his kind of back and thrusting over the top of his shield. This is incredibly short range and I think of dubious use. Breaking a spear shaft with a shield, would that work? Probably not. Look at movies where things like this spear are chopped through with a sword. We've done experiments, we've tried to do it. You can cut through a spear shaft, but it takes several blows with a sharp sword. It's not a lightsaber. Breaking through one with a shield, even less likely. So really, spear shafts are designed to be relatively durable. Relatively light, but not super light, but pretty strong. If they're not strong, then they're not going to work as effective weapons. We see Achilles' spear get broken by being stamped on. Now, this is slightly more plausible. I don't think it would be as easy as it's shown here. However, it's more plausible than breaking it with a shield. An 8 out of 10. This is a very special javelin, but this is an Olympic-style javelin. It's not really a weapon. If it's the same as a typical one, it's an aluminium tube with a kind of slightly pointy end. So this is not something that's designed to, you know, penetrate thick clothing or go through armor or anything like this. And I have to say, they're not terribly strong either. I mean, if you stepped on one, you could quite easily bend it. She's using it like a giant lightsaber, as if it's magically cutting through people, but I don't understand how or why. Finally, a stab. Oh, a double stab. So finally she thrust with it. I have no issue with that. She actually used a spear like a spear eventually, but you know, what's all the swinging it around? It's not going to cut anything. I'm going to give this a 1 out of 10. It really, really bugs me how he uses this spear. It is the most stupid way that he could have used this spear. Basically, he could have won this fight in the first few seconds if he just used it like a spear. Instead, he uses it like, I don't know, like a broom handle. He thrusts with the wrong foot backward, giving himself the minimum reach. He's got enough space, especially in a corridor, to occupy that space with the point of the spear and keep the opponent in front of him. So the main advantage of any polearm, but particularly of spears, is reach. But with reach also comes leverage. The two things go hand in hand. A small movement at the back end means a large movement at the top end. So quite simply, if you're trying to get around an opponent's shield, you can go from high to low. You could go above the shield and below the shield in the blink of an eye, which takes longer to do with a sword. The usual balance is a spear person can beat 2 sword people if there's no armor and no shields involved. A spear is a game changer. Spears can block with any part of the shaft. You can block with the tail end. Sometimes the middle of the shaft can be used. The problem with using the middle is it means any defense is closer to your body. But most predominantly, spears are used with the pointy end projecting forwards, and most of the defense will be done with the front end. The way he uses this spear is infuriating, and at one point, he's even got the spearhead pointing backwards away from the opponent while holding the blunt end outwards. I mean, he doesn't even have 2 spiky ends. It's an entirely metal spear, which is unusual. Generally, you wouldn't want to make a spear entirely out of metal because although it would be stronger, it would be so heavy that it would give up the advantages that the spear has. If you make it heavy, it also makes it far easier for the opponent to grab. Although they have a lot of advantages of reach and leverage, they are way, way easier to grab for the opponent to grab hold of than something like a sword. A sword is mostly blade, so it's harder to grab. This particular fight will get a really low score of 2 out of 10. I loved this episode, but this fight just sucked. Too much swinging of the spear, not enough thrusting. Thrusting doesn't look as impressive on screen. It's also slightly more dangerous for the actors as well. Despite the fact that in the modern world we probably think of axes or swords associated with Vikings, in any army in the so-called Dark Ages, in the early medieval period, the spear and shield was the primary weapon of battle. They fought in shield walls with a spear. Yeah, richer people might have a sword and other people might have an axe, but those are weapons that are only really useful once you've closed beyond spear range. One of the great things about spears is they are one of the best hand weapons that you can have in your hand, and they're also a really good missile weapon. At any moment they can get thrown, and psychologically that makes a huge difference within the fight. Even if the opponent doesn't throw the spear, the knowledge that they could throw it at any moment as a javelin really changes how you fight. It makes sure you keep your shield up. It makes you very wary. I've once been in a fight, in a tournament in fact, where the opponent had a spear and shield, I had sword and shield. So I'm up there preparing to protect my head and my torso against the spear throw, and I get a spear right in the leg. And if that had been a real spear and gone through my leg, then I wouldn't have been fighting anymore. Thrown spears are incredibly powerful. They will stick deeply into a shield. If they hit you in the body, you're in big, big trouble. I mean, they'll go through a person's torso, and they'll also penetrate certain types of armor. I would give this 6 out of 10. So what we see here is the famous pike phalanx. These are Macedonians, but pike phalanxes were used all over the ancient world. They were used by the Romans initially as very good against cavalry. It makes it very difficult for cavalry to operate on the battlefield. These are very, very long spears. You're far more limited in how you can use them. You don't generally turn them around and use the back end, although these pikes do have a counterbalance on the back end with a spike on it. Now that's partially so that if the pike gets broken, you can turn it around and use the other end still as a weapon. Also, it provides a counterbalance so you can hold more of the pike out in front. Hoplites were quite characteristic for using the pike two-handed. They needed to use it two-handed because it was so big and relatively heavy, but they also used shields. And so what they did is they strapped the shield in such a way that they can hide behind the shield to some degree, obviously protection against arrows, but also protection against enemy pikes. This has been represented very, very well, very accurately. So against arrows, it's difficult because you know, you're holding a great long pike with two hands and you've kind of got a shield suspended. It's not that easy to, at that point, put your shield up because you're not really holding the shield in the typical way. And also the shield doesn't cover your whole body. The problem with arrows is they'll find, it doesn't matter how good the armor is or what shields you're carrying, they will find gaps. So absolutely, peppering a phalanx with arrows is good advice. So one little detail, it makes it look like the pike is traveling very, very quickly and piercing bodies. And the one thing you have to say about pikes is they don't move quickly because they only move as quickly as the pike block moves. You can stab a bit with the pike, but it doesn't go through an awful lot of motion. 8 out of 10. So it's a massive, massive glaive. A glaive is an English word for a weapon that's essentially like a falchion or broad sword on the end of a stick. So it has the reach of a polearm, but it has the cutting and thrusting abilities and type of a sword. And it would be a form of dao. A dao is a single-edged weapon. So it's something that's very effective at cutting. That's a very, very big glaive head. So this is a heavy polearm. Okay, I actually like the cutting mechanics that he's doing. They're pretty good, but why have they got to grappling distance? He shouldn't have allowed the swordsman to get that close. If you get to grappling distance, the swordsman has the advantage. spinning around the neck. It's not something you'd really want to do in a real fight at all, unless you wanted to lose. I wouldn't say he's necessarily holding it in the most logical way, because he's given up all of his reach advantage by holding it across his body. The opponent's got a sword. He's got a weapon that's twice its length, so he should be using the reach advantage. I mean, it's beautifully choreographed, but a lot of it is totally unrealistic to how you'd actually use those weapons. And that goes for the swords or the polearms. 3 out of 10. So the bad guy has what we'd probably call it a form of halberd. So a halberd is essentially an axe blade with a rear spike, and usually they have a top spike, but if the axe blade is shaped to have a top spike already, then you don't need an additional top spike. Now, the way he's using it, it looks comedic, but actually, can you think, if you're occupying a space, how intimidating that would be? This is a weapon which weighs, probably, if it was a real one and if it was steel, probably about 6 pounds. If someone's got a 6 pound weapon, of which about 5 pounds of that is the end, and they're whirling it around, that's really, really intimidating. One hit from that and you're going down. Absolutely the right thing against a polearm wielder. I really, really liked it as a fight. An 8 out of 10. I would say that out of the movies that we've looked at today, Troy is the first one that comes to mind that actually shows spears used like spears. I think that this is one of the best spear fights on screen. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Why don't you click on this one up here to see something else that hopefully you'll enjoy as well.